So going on with the show, our next presenter is a friend of mine who went to school, he says, much longer than he should have. He's got a PhD in political science, but only to discover later his love was in design. He is now starting a MFA in design at the University of Illinois this fall. Maurice Meilleur.
Love you, honey. So the way I got from political theory to graphic design was my love of type and typography, and I'm a total nerd about this stuff, and if you don't believe me, just wait 6.5 minutes. Or you can ask my wife, who got me to admit that I really should have called this talk 3 things that Maurice didn't know about type and letters until he got obsessed with them. So number 1 has to do with why people who use the Latin alphabet make many big and small letters differently, like the A's, the G's, and the R's, and what's up with all that slanty writing? Well, it turns out that the way we write our alphabet, our one alphabet, is actually with 3 different scripts, which is styles of making letters, and we've come over time to think of them all together. The capitals we get from Roman letters. Top image here. It's a great example. It's Trajan's column in Rome. It was carved in the year 113. Beautiful? Yeah. Easy to write? No. So people learned to write them faster with cursive letters, and they changed even their nicer scripts to make them easier to use. Now, when Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Emperor in 799, he couldn't read, probably because of everybody's crappy writing. And he decided that everybody in the empire ought to write their letters the same standard legible way. Now, whether you like that idea or not seemed to depend on how far away from the capital you lived, but it worked pretty well overall, and the so-called minuscules from that reform became a model for Italian printers. But the Italians actually had 2 models for their type in the 15th century. The other was a more cursive, sometimes slanty type that got used for contracts and correspondence, but by itself it's not very legible. So by the late 16th century, this script had become kind of secondary to the Roman capitals. But wait, didn't Gutenberg's Bible use a completely different script? Well, yes, it did. But what we call blackletter script was beautiful, worked well, but it wasn't very popular, held out longest with the Germans, who didn't give it up until the 20th century, but that is another pachakcha. Now, as much as people cared about the way their letters looked, it turns out that we don't actually read them. Well, okay, we do read them, but we don't read individual letters one at a time. We read shapes, shapes of clusters of letters, shapes of words, shapes of groups of words, and we're so good at it we can read writing even if it just hints at those shapes. But it wasn't always like that. Look at that text there on the Trajan's column again. It's just a big string of letters, right? It's not a problem if you're reading aloud, which is what people did at the time. You practice, habit tells you what sounds to make, you go slow. But around the 400s or so, people started to read to themselves, and those big strings of letters became big pains in the ass. And so Irish monks, in the beginning of the early 7th century, came up with a solution. They started to put spaces between the words. Like here on the left, this is the very famous Book of Kells. It was made around the year 800, and even those small little word spaces made a huge difference. And printers kept doing it themselves. And it's a pretty great practice because it actually lets us read words as coherent shapes that we recognize all at once. And now think about those scripts again. When you string all those capitals together, what do you get? Rectangles. When you string capitals and minuscules together, you get unique word shapes, not just the outlines but the spaces between them, which makes silent readers very happy. And that is because our eyes are a lot more comfortable moving down lines of text in jumps that we call saccades. They take in groups of text shapes all at once. Sometimes we jump back, make sure we caught everything, then we move forward again. The more experienced we are, the larger the chunks and the faster we read, so spacing words and using different scripts comes in pretty handy. But once you start talking about how exactly to make those shapes, those letters you're supposed to string together to make words, well, things start to get tricky because then you're talking about spelling. And there's not many topics in the history of alphabetical writing more controversial than that. Now, in an ideal alphabet, every letter matches up with exactly one of the smallest pieces of sound in the language. That's what's supposed to make it so great. Because if we use one mark or shape for every word, we'd have as many marks as we have words. In English, that might be anywhere between like 200,000 and a million. Even 1 mark a syllable gets us only about 15 or 16,000. So ideally, alphabets are great, but in reality, spoken and written language are always 2 different things. And thanks to geography and history and accident history, letters have always been ambiguous. We have lots of ways of spelling the same sounds, and we have lots of ways of pronouncing the same spellings. And the differences don't really make any logical sense. Sometimes all we can depend on is context. And English is notorious for being one of the worst offenders because of how many words we borrowed from other languages. Because their speakers invaded English lands, or English speakers invaded their lands, or we spent time trading with each other, or all of the above. So what do you do if you write with an alphabet? Well, some people mark up the letters a little bit to let readers know exactly which sounds they mean. But English writers, we typically rely on context. Surrounding letters, words, grammar, even just the topic. So if you're reading a text on fishing, BASS is bass. But if it's on music, BASS is bass. It's all very complicated. And just try explaining it to someone who's trying to learn how to speak the language. So every so often we get reformers along. Noah Webster, for example, he wanted to clean up English spelling and also defend American English spelling against the influence of those bad British English spellers. And he wrote a whole meticulous dictionary to make his point. But reforms like his still leave people arguing about spelling. Why? Because language and writing just keep changing. So, should we stop trying to spell correctly? No. Remember what I said about shapes? Well, it turns out conventional spelling helps a lot. It gives us shapes we're used to seeing. It's kind of like the rules of the road. There's nothing better about driving on the right or the left side, but if you want to avoid collisions, well, it helps if everybody respects the same conventions. So spelling is worth caring about. But on the other hand, phonics gets a little tricky because it assumes 2 things that we know aren't true, that we read strings of individual letters and that each letter is associated with a specific sound. It might work at first, but the longer you rely on it, the harder kids have to work to square the way they're being taught about writing with the way that people actually use it. So, one last thing, a little shout out. There are actually people whose job it is to think about this stuff all the time, right? Scripts and shapes and spelling and other cool and not so cool things. They're called type designers. They're behind everything you type, from a keyboard, virtually everything you read in print or online. The more I learn about this stuff, the more I respect these people. So,